This meeting is being recorded.
So should we get started, Henry?
I think you can start now. Go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be, and welcome to this session on the Adaptation Gap Report 2022, which was launched at the end of last year, November, just ahead of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And my name is Henry Neufeld. I'm head of the Impact Assessment and Adaptation Unit at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, and I am the chief scientific editor of the GAP report. And today we have a number of presentations to give you an insight into the topic, into the content of last year's report. And first of all, I'd like to introduce and welcome Dr. Martin Capel as the UNEP responsible representative based in Nairobi. He will say a few words around this report. After that, I'll pass on to Lars Christensen, and he will give a short introduction of what the report is about, some background information, and then also moderate the panel presenting on the contents of the report. And after that, there will be a panel of representatives of the youth, of locally led organizations, and gender experts to respond to some questions that we are putting forward to them in response to the GAP report. And after that, there will hopefully be enough time for some Q&A. So I'll stop here and pass it on to Martin. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Great to be here. Hello, everyone. I see we got quite some attendees now joining in the last few minutes. It's my pleasure to provide some welcoming words and opening remarks on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. My name is Martin Capel. I am the head of thematic assessments at UNEP. And I'm also the head of the secretariat of what is the World Adaptation Science Program, the WASP. And in this function, I'm part of the secretariat responsible for the production of the Adaptation Gap Report. The Adaptation Gap Report, or AGR in short, is an annual report produced by UNEP, the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, and the World Adaptation Science Program. And the 2022 edition of the report provides insights in the urgency for accelerated adaptation necessary to prepare for ever-increasing impacts of climate change around the world. As Henry said, the report was launched in November last year in the run-up to COP27 in Egypt. The report was following at the COP highly mentioned in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, which shows the relevance of the report to the climate negotiations by member states. And UNEP, headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, considers the report a key contribution to help the world move fast forward on the climate change adaptation agenda. And the AGR has been produced for many years and provides the latest science for policy and decision makers on the status of adaptation planning, finance, and implementation, as well as deep dive topics of interest. And today it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of UNEP and its partners to a lively session here on the report. And I would like to especially welcome our speakers. First of all, the report's editors, Henry Neufeld and Lars Christensen, both at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, and to our lead authors, Marcus Davies from the Climate Policy Radar, Paul Watkins at Paul Watkins Associates, and Timo Leiter at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And also a truly warm welcome to our panelists, Dilruba Haider at UN Women in Bangladesh, Sohanur Rahman at YouthNet for Climate Justice, and Hassan Mohammed Mahoudou at ActionAid Bangladesh. And kindly let me thank you all up front for your participation and contributions. And we really look forward to a great session, including a good Q&A session with all these great panelists. So a huge welcome to all. And now back to you, Henry, for the next agenda item. Thank you all.
Thank you, Martin. Yes,
Thanks a
so
lot,
I'll
Martin.
hand over straight away to Lars to give a short introduction to the report. And the floor is yours, Lars.
Yeah, many thanks, Henry, and many thanks for these words, Martin. So as mentioned, my name is Lars Christiansen, and I'm a Senior Project Officer at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. Before we get started on presenting the report's key findings, I will make a very quick introduction to what the Adaptation Gap Report is and the outline and conceptual framing of the 2022 report. UNEP has been, as mentioned, producing Adaptation Gap Reports since 2014, this being the 7th edition, launched ahead of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November of last year. Since the beginning, the primary objective of the Adaptation Gap Report series has been to assess global adaptation gaps and inform on the status and results of global adaptation efforts. The IPCC Working Group 2's sixth assessment report released last year provided a comprehensive assessment of climate risk levels for various regions and sectors and against different warming scenarios, as illustrated in this central figure from the report. Importantly, the report highlighted how the world will face severe climate risks even under low emission scenarios. This highlights also how adaptation really must take center stage alongside mitigation efforts in the global response to the global climate crisis. An Adaptation Gap Report assessing progress on global adaptation goals is therefore as important as ever. Since 2020, the Adaptation Gap Report is developed around a recurrent two-part structure. That is, the same basic outline will be applied to all Adaptation Gap Reports towards the first global stocktake this year in 2023. Part 1 is the core element in this recurring format and involves the assessment of 3 central elements of the adaptation process: planning, financing, and implementation, with 1 chapter dedicated to each as indicated in this slide. Part 2 is an in-depth assessment which synthesizes knowledge on a specific topic to provide supplementary perspectives and nuance to the findings from Part 1. The theme of this in-depth assessment is decided from year to year in light of global developments, international priorities, and needs of the UNFCCC. In 2020, this topic was nature-based solutions. In 2021, it was on emerging consequences of the COVID pandemic and potential opportunities for adaptation in the recovery process. And in 2022, it explores the current knowledge of the effectiveness of global adaptation efforts. The finding from Part 1 and Part 2 is then used to provide insight on 3 interlinked questions, which are really the core of the report's assessment of the global adaptation gap. What has been done to adapt until today? To what extent have climate risks been reduced? And depending on the temperature trajectory, are current adaptation efforts likely to reduce future climate risks? And finally, just before handing over to presentations of key findings from the report, let me again remind you that if you have any questions or comments for the presentations or for the panel that comes after, that you can ask these in writing using the Q&A function or the regular chat, whatever you prefer. You can do this at any time during the webinar, so just feel free to go ahead anytime. We will monitor these questions and try to include as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end of the session. And with that, I think let me hand over to Marcus Davis from Climate Policy Radar. As mentioned, Marcus was one of the authors of the planning chapter and will present the key findings on progress of adaptation planning. Let me just stop sharing so you can share, Marcus.
Thanks very much, Lars. Just give me a second. Great. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Yes. Hello, everybody. As Lars mentioned, my name is Marcus Davies. I'm a policy analyst at Climate Policy Radar, and I was a contributing author to this chapter on adaptation planning. Unfortunately, none of the lead authors were available, so I'm going to provide an overview of the findings and answer any questions as best I'm able to. So just to start with an overview of the structure of the chapter, This chapter is essentially broken into three main sections. The first section on an overview of progress in national adaptation planning, and so that takes into account an examination of the national laws and policies and other documentation that has been made publicly available by national governments, such as national adaptation plans, to indicate the extent to which governments have been taking action on adaptation planning. It also relates to quantified and measurable targets that national governments have been setting in relation to adaptation. The second part of the chapter is on the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation planning. So that refers to an assessment of the implementability of plans and targets that national governments have produced. And this was also discussed in the previous Adaptation Gap Report. But newly this year, it also relates to inclusiveness and on promoting adaptation. Sorry, the third section is on promoting adaptation, mitigation, interlinkages. And I'll say a little bit more about what that means shortly. So firstly, the section of the chapter on progress, overall progress in national adaptation planning, our key findings were that at least 84% of countries have now produced at least one adaptation planning instrument. And so a planning instrument refers to either a policy document such as a strategy or a framework law, or a national adaptation plan, or a national adaptation communication. So that's up from 74% in 2021, 74% of countries in 2021. So that distribution is what is expressed in the map on the left-hand side of the slide. And another key finding, at least 1/3 of countries have a quantified time-bound target that relates to adaptation. So our data for these planning instruments and targets, there's more kind of information on the methodology for that in the appendix to the chapter, but it mostly draws on combined methodology of Climate Policy Radar and the Grantham Institute, Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Most of the targets that I mentioned are based on process-related outputs as opposed to intended outcomes. So an example of what I mean by that is that a majority of the targets that we identified refer, for example, to a process-related output with, for example, designation of marine or coastal protected areas, as opposed to intended outcomes of adaptation actions, such as, for example, targets relating to number of cases of human vector-borne diseases associated with climate change. We note that a number of countries have integrated these targets into national laws and policies, and I'll speak about the benefits of doing so. But we note that the reason why this is critical is that it allows for the monitoring and enforcement of these targets. So onto the second section on adequacy and effectiveness. We note that adaptation laws and policies increasingly appear to be considering the needs of groups identified as, depending on local circumstances, potentially especially exposed to climate risk. So these are groups defined in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So this is what this sort of chart expresses on the left-hand side of the slide. And again, more information on the methodology in the appendix to the chapter, but just a quick word on that. This data was essentially gathered by drawing up keyword taxonomies relating to each of these groups and using Climate Policy Radar's search tools to identify references to those groups in our corpus of national laws and policies. So this chart gives a sense of distribution of those references. I should say that just an important qualification here is that this is not an assessment of the number of policies or laws which specifically deal with these these groups, such as, such as, for example, women, indigenous peoples, children and young people, but rather just mentions of those groups. So that's used as a kind of proxy for analysing inclusiveness. So almost 90% of the laws and policies that we studied contain at least one reference to at least one of these groups. We also find on implementability that countries are increasingly adhering to good practices to enhance implementability of their instruments. So examples of those good practice include setting concrete goals and objectives, setting clear timeframes, and investment in capacity building. Finally, on adaptation mitigation interlinkages, we explore in the chapter 3 types of interlinkage: future-proof planning, the co-benefits of adaptation and mitigation actions, and the trade-offs of adaptation and mitigation actions. Our key findings mostly center on co-benefits. And so we find that mitigation benefits of adaptation actions are most commonly cited in adaptation instruments in the agriculture, forestry, water and energy sectors. So for example, we find discussion of co-benefits, for example, the fact that improving crop management or post-harvest management can improve resilience of crops, but also at the same time reduce emissions from crops. On the other hand, adaptation benefits of mitigation actions include, for example, investment in high efficiency stoves or investment in public transportation. We also find evidence of discussion of mitigation adaptation trade-offs as well, and discussion among particularly climate exposed countries where there is explicit statement of a prioritization of adaptation. And we stress in the chapter that discussion of co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation actions should not ignore the need that countries may face to consider these trade-offs. So that's an overview of the findings of that chapter. Obviously, a summary of those findings can also be found in the chapter itself, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Really excellent presentation. And if you can stop sharing, you have done that. I now pass the floor to Paul Watkis from Paul Watkis Associates. Paul, he was one of the lead authors of the finance chapter, and he will present findings from the finance chapter.
Thank you very much, Lars. Just to check that you can hear me okay.
We hear you just fine.
And you can see some slides as well.
Yes, perfect.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the adaptation finance gap. And so what we do every year is we look at the estimated adaptation costs, and then we compare those to our tracking of adaptation finance flows. And the difference between the two is, of course, the finance gap. And we've been doing that for a number of years. I mean, a couple of years ago, we sort of made a sort of approximate estimate that the adaptation costs for developing countries could be of the order of 160 to 340 billion dollars a year by 2030, and potentially double or even quadruple that by 2050. And what we've found since then, and certainly one of the updates we have done for the 22 gap report, there's been a lot more submitted and updated NDCs and new NAPs coming through. And you can see from the sort of the figure again, the sort of profile across those. And what we're finding now is a larger number of those actually include estimates of adaptation finance needs. So they include estimates of countries' expected adaptation costs implicitly through their expression of financial needs. Around 76 countries have actually put numbers on their adaptation priorities. When we add those up, that's around $71 billion a year. And by extrapolating that to all developing countries, we sort of very approximately estimate that the total adaptation finance needs could be about $200 billion dollars a year in 2030. So that's a kind of indicative estimate, and that's our first and our starting point. And then what we do is we compare those to current international finance flows. We primarily track public flows, and we sort of add up the adaptation finance flows from bilateral, multilateral, and international funds. You can see different pictures on the left-hand side. I think the sort of key message is in the third bullet point. And that's really when we add these up, we see the public flows at around $29 billion a year for adaptation in developing countries. And whilst that's been increasing a little bit over recent years, at that sort of rate of increase, we're a long way from our from the 100 billion target, and certainly a very long way away from our estimated adaptation costs. I think when we look more broadly, we do also look at domestic finance flows and private sector flows. Certainly, domestic flows from countries for adaptation is increasing, but it's also the last couple of years have been really very challenging for countries in terms of their fiscal space. A lot of countries don't have the sort of fiscal room to sort of spend a lot more on adaptation. That's been a real change in the global landscape on finance. And at the same time, we also see some promising private sector initiatives for adaptation finance. But I think it's very clear that and very important that we say that private sector finance on its own is unlikely to fill the adaptation gap. And that's because although you can borrow from the private sector or from the markets for adaptation, in terms of the private sector actually delivering adaptation, we find it's a lot more challenging to get companies to invest in adaptation than it is in mitigation. As a very simple example, it's a lot easier to get companies to invest in renewable energy than it is, for example, in flood defenses. I think one of the things is, given that we have limited amounts of finance flows that are available, there's a question mark about the efficiency and the effectiveness of how we spend that finance. And I think it's maybe 2 points to highlight. One is we are perhaps not spending and as being as strategic as we could be in targeting the adaptation finance that we have to the most vulnerable. And I think that's a really important issue with respect to equity. At the same time, we also could perhaps leverage more money if we use some of that finance to de-risk private sector investment. So in terms of trying to increase the share of the private sector in investing in adaptation, again, there might be more opportunities to use the available finance that we have. And then, as you know, this year's GAP report looked at mitigation and adaptation. We find that climate finance rarely addresses both of those simultaneously. And that's partly because quite often there are financial or policy barriers or constraints to doing that. So whilst on paper, it may look very sensible to do mitigation and adaptation together, there are quite often some challenges or trade-offs that make that a lot more difficult in practice. So finally, taking stock, we estimate the finance gap at around a sort of level of about 5 to 10 times. What do I mean by that? I mean that the available finance that we have is probably 5 to 10 times too low compared to our estimated adaptation costs. That's a very significant gap. It's also clear that even if we double finance flows, as been discussed at the previous COP, we're not going to fill that gap through that level of finance increase alone. So we have something here that sort of indicates a really sizable issue. More positively, there is a discussion around a new collective goal on climate finance that will link through to the 25 discussion. And I think that has the opportunity to help close that gap. But that will require a sort of step change in what we're doing now in trying to look at all those different issues that I mentioned. And finally, and I think also very positively, we're starting the process of updating and doing a major revision of the adaptation finance gap for the 2023 edition of the Adaptation Gap Report. And so I think we'll have a little bit more in terms of robust numbers and a little bit more detail that we'll be able to communicate just on where we are. That I think will be, again, a useful contribution to this sort of issue and hopefully provide some additional insights for the international negotiations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And thanks for that little teaser for the next year's report also. That's really helpful, and we're looking forward to that update, all of us, I think. I'll now welcome Timo Leiter from, as mentioned, Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Timo was the lead author on the implementation chapter and will present on that chapter. Are you there, Timo? Yes, great.
Yes, thank you very much, Lars, and hi, everyone. My presentation should
go
be...
to presentation mode.
Yeah. Oops. Okay. You can see?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay, I'm happy to present chapter 4, which is the implementation chapter, which you see here together with the list of the co-authors. And so this chapter has the aim to look at, okay, what about implementation of adaptation? So we have the planning, we have the finance, but what is being done with that today? To what does that lead? And so the implementation chapter only looks at things whose implementation has actually already started. So it's not looking at appraisals or proposals, but actual implementation. We have in the 2017 Adaptation Gap Report already discussed the challenges of assessing global adaptation actions. Because, for instance, what we need is a data source, a global data source that is telling us in coherent and quality-proofed data what adaptation actions are being taken. And so, because of that, there are some limitations to the scope. So, but in general, the chapter aims to look at adaptation actions globally. There are these three limitations of the scope. First, we primarily look at international climate finance in terms of actions being funded by international climate finance. So this is how this links to the finance chapter. Secondly, we look at actions that countries report to UNFCCC, for example, through their adaptation communications or through NAP documents. And finally, we look primarily at the national level. So we cannot in this chapter check every local activity that are not reported by countries or that are not funded through international climate finance. And so the three data sources that we use, you see here. The first one is project documents from the UNFCCC funds that officially serve the Paris Agreement or the Convention. That means the Adaptation Fund, the sub-funds of the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. And secondly, this is a new data source in the 2022 report, are the adaptation communications that countries submit to UNFCCC. And third, as already used in last year's report, is the database from the OECD Development Assistance Committee on Adaptation Funds. And if you're interested in further details, the annex to the chapter outlines the data sources and how they were analyzed. Okay, looking at the results, this is the key chart of the chapter. This diagram shows you the number of adaptation projects from the UNFCCC funds, namely the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, and the GEF sub-funds over time since 2006. 2006 because it was the first time that we have a dedicated adaptation project. Again, we are looking here only at projects that explicitly aim at adaptation. We're not looking at projects that might have co-benefits for adaptation. And the second aspect that you see here in this diagram, which is the red line throughout the chart, is the total volume of new projects that started every year. So if 10 projects started in a particular year, which if they had a volume of 10 million every year, the red line would be at 100 million. And now we can look at these two things one after each other. First, if you look at the number of projects, there's a steady increase from 2006 to 2015. And then a change that you see, and these are the green colors that are coming in and the black colors on top of the bars, that we see larger volumes of projects, particularly because of the Green Climate Fund becoming operational. So we see projects that are beyond 10 million or even beyond 50 million. And if we look at the red line, which is the total value of new projects per year, we see also an increase, and then a very strong increase between 2016 and 2018, and then a drop, which was largely due to the US at that point in time strongly reducing their adaptation funds. And the line has rebounded. The end of the diagram of the chart for 2022, we only have incomplete data, so therefore we can't really say for 2022. But what we can say is that the total annual value of new adaptation projects through these three funds is around $500 million per year. And that has stayed constant on average since around 2018. Importantly, everything you see here in the slide represents only 9% of the total adaptation funds that Paul was speaking about in chapter 4. Why only 9%? Because it's only looking at the funds channeled through these 3 funds, the adaptation fund, the GCF, and the GEF. So this chart does not account for all the bilateral adaptation support, and it does not account for any other funds, for example, the PPCR, the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience. But in general, this diagram really summarizes the trends in adaptation finance through these UNFCCC funds. And the second key finding from the chapter is, so another analysis we did is on the OECD DAC database, where donors report the activities they are doing. Not each of the entries represents a full project, but activities. And so the upper chart, which you see here, is the number of actions that donors labeled as principal adaptation, meaning it's claimed that these projects would primarily focus on adaptation as their primary objective. And you can see it's increasing, but the key interesting fact here is the blue line. So what we've been doing is a text analysis of the entries in the database. There is not that much text, unfortunately, for most entries, but for the text that exists, we've been looking at, is it likely that these activities have aimed at reduction of exposure or reduction of vulnerability? And we found that on average, just around 30% of those projects, which again claim to be fully about adaptation, are actually addressing these 2 key dimensions of adaptation, which would mean that there's the likelihood that quite a significant number of projects labeled as principal adaptation are actually not primarily about adaptation, which is a really important finding. And in the lower part of the diagram, you also see the amount of money this refers to. So the figures are a bit higher there, but still it's just less than 50% of the total financial volume claimed as being principally about adaptation, being about adaptation under this methodology of text analysis. So again, as with the planning chapter, this is only one particular methodology to check this, and the database contains limited information, but this finding is consistent with previous findings, including our chapter in the 2021 report, where we had a similar findings through a different methodology, namely manually going through these entries rather than through text analysis. And you see another diagram on this analysis here, which shows you also the amount of like the volume of adaptation projects per sector. So you can see that on the left, principal adaptation projects in the education and energy sector seem to be smaller, and transportation, for example, is much larger. And also you can see the percentage of actions that we find explicitly address adaptation. Inviting you to have a look at this diagram in the chapter, since we have to move on to the final slide. And now one of the topics of this year's report has been interlinkages between mitigation and adaptation. Very briefly, what we did is we looked at the Green Climate Funds projects that are called cross-cutting, meaning that they address both mitigation and adaptation. And what we found is that the projects that the cross-cutting projects that do more adaptation tend to be smaller in size than the cross-cutting projects that mainly do mitigation. So we looked at basically if a project is called cross-cutting, is it actually doing more adaptation or is it actually doing more mitigation? And you can also find the findings of this analysis in the chapter. So the final slide I have is kind of some summary points on the interlinkages between mitigation and adaptation. So importantly, what we found is that not every sector has the same potential for achieving synergies between mitigation and adaptation. So we cannot expect every single project to do, to go all in on mitigation and simultaneously on adaptation. There are potentials, but there are more in some sectors like agriculture or ecosystems than in others. But in general, we find that it's important to look into this, but that projects really need to explain, if they claim to be cross-cutting, to what extent they address adaptation and mitigation. And with that, I would like to hand back to Lars. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Timo, for that excellent presentation also, and for keeping the time especially also. Finally, I'll hand over to my colleague, back to my colleague, Henry Neufeld. Beyond being the chief scientific editor of the report, Henry is also a lead author on the effectiveness chapter of the report and will present main findings from that analysis, as well as an outlook on the report findings as a whole. So I hope you're ready, Henry, and over to you.
Thank you, Lars. Can you see my screen?
Yes, just need to go to presentation.
Yeah. Yes, so thanks again, Lars.
Can you switch displays? Because we're seeing the presenter display.
Oh, really? Switch.
I think there is a way to do that on the top. Swap displays on the top of your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but it's jumping over. Gosh, I can't get it done. That's strange. Very weird. How do I do this?
If you want, I can run it from my side.
Yeah, maybe that's better. Sorry.
I'll
stop sharing.
This. Just a second, we'll be there.
There, I'll stop sharing. Yeah, I don't know why it's not working. I'm sorry.
No worries. It's coming now. Should see it now, I hope. Do you see it, Henry?
Yes, I can see it.
Good, great. So I think you can go ahead.
Okay, so apologies for that.
Should I jump to the first slide?
Yes, just the current adaptation practice. That one is the right one. Yeah. So this year's report also looked specifically at the effectiveness of adaptation and concluded that adaptation practice is currently woefully poor. And adaptation practice efficiency or effectiveness is important to look at because when we count implementation, we know nothing about how good adaptation is in reality. And as this figure shows, adaptation actions that lead to positive outcomes are often based on principles of good adaptation practice. And I will speak more about those principles in the next slide. Current adaptation actions are largely incremental. They do not consider future climate and may lead to maladaptation because of inadequate involvement of stakeholders, lack of attention to local contexts, retrofitting development actions as adaptation, short-term focus, and failing to address social transformation and climate justice, including entrenching or maintaining power relations. While data on effectiveness and adequacy of adaptation is very limited and urgently needed, the results also show that hybrid solutions addressing multiple dimensions of climate risks are typically better than simple solutions. And what this means is that when we address different dimensions, governance, technical, finance, building capacity, and involving these different actors together to develop solutions, those projects, those activities tend to have better outcomes than those where we follow simple implementation practices or only one way of addressing a climate hazard. Next slide, please. Next slide. Lars?
Yep.
Next slide.
Yep. It's changing on my screen.
Oh, okay, good. I'm sorry.
Is it not, you don't see it?
It's okay.
How to improve adaptation practice?
No,
that's the slide.
Yeah, no,
I think I'm sharing.
if it's changed, I'm sorry, I can't see it from here.
All right, okay.
So I wanted to talk about some of these principles of good adaptation practice. And we were able to synthesize these principles from a range of peer-reviewed and gray literature that we analyzed to look at what good adaptation practice actually looks like. And critically, it involves genuine inclusion of stakeholders, local communities, indigenous peoples, women, and other marginalized groups into decision-making and co-development of adaptation solutions. That is, when we bring people together and develop the solutions from the planning to the implementation stage together, we can ensure that the challenges that often occur when that doesn't happen can be minimized. Transparency, accountability, and predictability of support. And what that means is that we can, if projects are transparent in the way they are set up, and they can account for the practices that they are implementing, and they are accountable to the public, and we have predictability of support, that also enhances the practice. When we start planning, implementing activities, our thoughts around what works typically aren't correct in a way. And we need to adjust those things as we move forward. And therefore, adaptive management is critical to successful implementation of adaptation. Investment in local capabilities, capacity building, and democratic governance are important as well, because otherwise there cannot be any ownership and local participation of initiatives that are being undertaken. And democratic governance is important in all circumstances. Not considering future climate risks really goes to the heart of what adaptation is about. We might be able to adapt to what is currently at risk because of climate change or climate impacts, but if we don't consider the future, our adaptation actions might be completely underestimating what we need to be adapting to. And therefore, this component is critical to good adaptation practice. The integration of local, traditional, and indigenous and scientific knowledge into the design, the implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation of activities is also critical to avoid just having one predominant narrative that tells us what the reality might be when others have different views and different values and different systems of accounting for their views and realities. And then underlying all of this, tackling inequalities and structural drivers of vulnerability, in addition to reducing exposures and vulnerabilities to climate hazards, which is what we could say risk reduction, is absolutely essential. So underlying the direct components of climate risk, we have to address the inequalities and structural drivers of vulnerability, poverty, lack of health, the environment being destroyed, other problems that are underlying those climate hazards, which are basically enhancing existing injustices and power relationships. Those things need to be addressed in order to have stronger results. And I think if we look at those things and implement our activities with those key practices and principles in mind, our chances of improving adaptive management and adaptation practice are pretty good. We know what needs to be done, but we actually need to do these things when we implement our actions. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Just a second.
So,
yes, I'll stop sharing here. Yeah, thanks a lot, Henry. And this concludes our very quick run through of the findings from the report. I hope this has piqued your interest, and we would, of course, very much encourage you to pick up the full report, which has much more detail than what we are able to cover in this short session. It can be found on UNEP's website. We will now proceed to a short panel discussion, and here I will hand it back to Henry Neufeld. Henry will moderate the panel discussion and the following Q&A session. So back to you, Henry.
Thanks again, Lars. And sorry for the technical glitches here. I don't know what happened. Last time I did this, it worked perfectly, so I don't quite understand the problem. In fact, anyway, before starting off with the panel questions to our three panelists, and I will introduce them briefly, let me just say that you might get the wrong impression that this report was developed by a bunch of white males from the global north, when in fact 40% of the authors were female and half of the authors actually came from the global south. It's just that in this occasion, coincidentally, we were not able to bring some of the other authors on board. So I think it's important to mention this because it might be giving the wrong impression here. Now, to the panel, we will have three panelists, one speaking about climate and sort of locally led adaptation, the other about gender, and the third about youth in the context of the Adaptation Gap Report. I'll introduce the panelists and then ask a question or two to each of them, and then we move on. And then after that session, I'll moderate the Q&A as well. So first panelist is Sohanur Rahman from YouthNet for Climate Justice. He is a prominent young climate advocate serving as the coordinator of the largest youth network for climate justice in Bangladesh. He is a founding member of the global youth movement Fridays for Future in his country and co-chair of the Partnership Executive Committee for the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network. So, Sohanur.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm getting lots of questions here. Sorry, I have to turn this thing off to avoid the pings. The Adaptation Gap Report found that children and young people may be somewhat better represented within national adaptation laws and policies than themes like gender, indigenous peoples, migrants, persons with disabilities, etc., though this does not necessarily suggest that they are the subject of concrete policy measures. References to children, references to children, young people, and future generations in the report identified that over 400 of the over 500 adaptation laws and policy studied had references to that. So the question I have to you, the first one is, in your view and experience, is such apparent prioritization of youth in adaptation planning also being adequately reflected in implementation on the ground? And if not, what are the barriers preventing this? That's the first question.
Yeah. Thank you, Henry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And you showed in your presentation that to accelerating adaptation, especially locally led adaptation and tackling maladaptation, the solution is the local leadership, inclusion, especially inclusive leadership of women, girls, young people, and children. So in my view and field level experience, that the prioritization of youth in adaptation planning is not always adequately reflected in implementation on the ground or front line, but children, especially young people, to tackling extreme event. So young people is the fast adapter and fast responder, but we are not getting adequate financing and we are not involved in the process, like disaster management committee or adaptation committee or the process. So another issue is that in inclusion of young people and the children, so its issue is a limited financial resources and competing policy priorities, lack of sometimes political will, and adequate institutional capacity can all hinder effective implementation of adaptation policies. But in Bangladesh, we have a good example that Bangladesh NAP included young people as a stakeholder by organizing consultation in root level consultation and national level consultation. So we are engaged with the consultation process and developing NAP, but our concern is the implementation process. And sometimes the consultant or who are the responsible for the NAP development process, they're talking, we accommodate all slogan like youth inclusion, like gender. So we are asking not only inclusion of slogan, so you have to include us as an active partner from planning to execution, monitoring, evaluation at all process. Thank you. Over to Henry.
Thank you, Suhanua. That's very comprehensive, and it basically reflects what I was talking about in terms of good practices of adaptation, these principles to bring in the stakeholders, and that also includes youth. So do you have a suggestion how that contribution of the youth, of other stakeholders, could be enhanced, not only in the planning phase, sort of the NAPs, and where it's like you call the slogans, but also in implementation?
Yeah, thank you. Henry, when we are asking about climate justice, so no climate justice without the climate finance, especially adaptation financing. So yeah, you shared the huge gap. So it's not only adaptation gaps, it's also gaps of development, our development. It's also gap our protection. It's also gap our future and present. And you know, the young people, we are most vulnerable. And but we also taking action. But I mentioned about the resource gap and sometimes the recognition. But we are facing extreme event like floods and more extreme events. So climate-related disaster, storm, drought, and devastating effect on children's health, education, livelihood, mental health. So this, the adaptation gap will impacting in our present as well as future. Like presents, for example, children and young people may be forced to drop out of school. Like in Shamnagar, parents are selling their children in a white deed as a child labor for the pre-clean. So it's a new slavery. So because we can't support them for their adaptation process or adapting with the changing climate, as well as child marriage. Like the climate disasters are not impacting rich and poor equally. So poor families are taking child marriage as a negative coping mechanism to deal with this crisis. So for this adaptation gap, so we are bearing the burn and we are paying highest price, but we are not responsible for this crisis, you know, but we also adapting, but we are not getting enough access. So due to this adaptation gap, youth may face a lifetime of poverty and insecurity if they are unable to access education and secure employment opportunities. So my recommendation is that there is a risk that a failure to close the adaptation finance gap could adversely affect youth more than other vulnerable group. Because IPCC report is saying that young people will face the huge climate hazard. So it's my recommendation that increase adaptation financing and include children and young people at all adaptation process, because local adaptation requires youth leadership. Thank you. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you again, Suhanua. Yes, thanks a lot. Really excellent contribution here, and thanks a lot. Yes, so my next panelist is Diruda Haida. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce the name correctly. She's an expert in the field of disaster risk reduction, climate change, humanitarian actions, and gender equality. She is heading the Climate Change, Disaster Risk Reduction, and Humanitarian Portfolio of UN Women Bangladesh. Dilruba, the Adaptation Gap Report found that, I don't know if you could turn on your video, Dilruba.
I think I have. I don't know whether
now you have. Yes, great, thank you. Nice to meet you. So, Dilruba, the Gap Report found that references to gender issues in adaptation laws and policies, or the planning, appear to have increased over time. with a number of countries now publishing strategies specifically devoted to addressing gender and climate change. Does this finding reflect your experience from Bangladesh? And are changes, in your view, happening fast enough in terms of mainstreaming gender into adaptation planning and implementation? That's the question.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Lars. Yeah, I think the perception is more or less correct, in a sense that looking at various national adaptation plans, I mean, from Bangladesh point of view, I think the National Adaptation Plan in Bangladesh, we have another very key document, which is Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. All these plans are referencing to gender aspects, referencing to, you know, as your report has rightly mentioned, pointed out, that women are being, and vulnerable groups are being, you know, cited and mentioned. But the problem happens when it comes to action. When you are talking about actionability, that's where the gap is. So in the preamble, in the introduction, in the analysis, gender issues are coming, women's aspects are coming. But when you come to the actual actions, what are the actions that you know, the government or everybody else, all the stakeholders should be taking up? There you don't necessarily see actions which are focusing on women's needs. So that's how the problem remains. And I think the other very critical aspects which is missing is not recognizing or not bringing on the table the issue of women's leadership. I mean, women are actually the preservers of nature. And we see from our field experience that women are actually adapting already. And in fact, your the part of your finance gap, you have said that, you know, probably only 9% of the total adaptation fund is being, I mean, you reported because of the specific sources that you are looking at. But there was another study a few years back, in fact, ECAD probably ECAD would be able to say which report I'm talking about. It was, I think, IIED did a report where they showed that majority of the adaptation finance is coming from the people themselves. They are spending, the poorest of the people are actually spending the maximum amount of funding for adapting because they have to survive. They have to live. They can't wait for GCF. They can't wait for JEF. They can't wait for World Bank or for bilaterals or anybody to adapt with the consequences of climate change. So the people, and especially the women, we see how women are struggling and spending, you know, their money to, you know, to survive. So we and the women, the moment we see that women are brought into the leadership position, we see success of development efforts. We see, especially in Bangladesh, the microcredit, the story of success of microcredit or social forestry. You know, you name the, you know, successful community-based development efforts. It's been the story of women's leadership. So even for locally led adaptation, even for adaptation, we have to bring women to the leadership role to ensure that we have the necessary success of the adaptation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gurudhath, just a follow-up question to bringing women into leadership positions. How, I think that's a really important element that you just mentioned. How could that be strengthened? I mean, there are so many countries in which there are really significant barriers to women taking up these leadership roles. How can that be sort of, in your view, can be done?
Thank you for the question. I think there are some countries, there might be some structural barriers, but that shouldn't stop us from taking the point up globally. In countries like Bangladesh, we are a developing country. We have the role models of women providing the leadership in various development work, and in other countries also. And I think we have to develop the leadership capacity. That's another thing. And create the enabling environment. I mean, just saying that, okay, let's put some women on the leadership chair isn't enough. We have to increase the number of women coming into the leadership position. We have to provide the necessary environment for them to exercise their leadership and definitely develop their leadership capacity. We have to inform them, give them the necessary background information for them to effectively negotiate and engage and participate into the conversations and negotiations.
Thank you, Dilruda. Excellent. So a very clear message, strengthen women leadership and build the capacity and enabling environment for women to do so. Okay, our last panelist today, Mohammed Hassan.
You can just call me Hassan.
Hassan, okay,
Yeah,
good.
great.
Maybe that's definitely easier for me. Yes,
Okay.
so Hassan, he's a manager at the Resilience and Climate Justice Unit of Action Aid Bangladesh. Previously, he was the coordinator of climate change program at Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh, and he worked in Grameen Shatki. Hassan.
Yeah, sure.
The GAP report found that a clear majority of adaptation laws and policy studies referenced consultation with and importance of local communities in this adaptation process.
Yeah.
It highlighted how such links are particularly important for disaster risk management, forestry conservation, and resilience in the agriculture sector. Based on your experience from Bangladesh, what are the benefits of actively involving local communities in the planning and implementation of adaptation? And I recognize that there might be some overlap to the earlier questions, but go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Thank you very much. And thank you all the presenters and panelists over there. And I just echo what my friend Sohan and Dilruba mentioned. Definitely, this is the main tricky point. And you have made our life easy when you have given this example of that how the adaptation should be, and instead of the contextual perspective. Each of the area, if you think about this adaptation, it has its unique feature. Every area, the adaptation should be their local, based on their local context. Because let's say if you think about the two districts, just let's say Borguna districts and the Barishal districts in the southern belt area, you can see that in the agriculture field, they have some different adaptation features. In case of this water irrigation, in case of the crop yielding, whatever you think about that, every area has their own local context, and that has to be incorporated in the adaptation plan. And who knows best? The local people. Again, I'm given one example, one of the coastal district called Borguna district, and one of the river called, the next of this Borguna district, one of the river called the Boleshwar, it has high saline water. And the next, another river called Bishkhali, it has less saline water. And people know which of the period of the year it has less saline water, and they use that adaptation plan or project. We definitely should consult with these local people. They know very well about their geomorphology, they know how their water characteristics, how their wind features. They know each and everything. You rightly mentioned that the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, as well as the scientific knowledge. So that's the area. If we bring all together, really it makes a lot. And many organizations working here, by forming the community-based organization, you rightly mentioned, we have lots of forestation examples here in Bangladesh. Close to the Sundarbans, there are many community-based organizations. They're working in very nice way, but definitely it's very important to create ownership. many times we develop project and that is something like a top-down hierarchy. And when the project ends, it is not no more sustainable to some extent. But creating the local ownership, creating the inclusiveness of that community, that is most important. And in that case, local community should be incorporated from the planning, implementation, and you rightly mentioned monitoring and evaluation altogether.
Great. My follow-up question would again be like, how could that be improved vis-a-vis the current situation? What's your view on that?
It's very important to look at, Henry, we have a very nice policies. We have latest, we have a National Adaptation Plan, but before that we have Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, Climate Change Gender Action Plan, we have a Mujib Prosperity Plan. So we have a lots of plans, and no doubt they have a lots of pros and cons, but however, those are a couple of robust plans that can really give some good direction to the resilience area. But definitely it's very important how the adaptation has been get a view of the local adaptation. Salim says, one of our mentors, Salim sir, is here. Always we talk about this local adaptation. It creates the leadership of the local community. It creates the inclusiveness. It creates the equitability, and it also creates the sustainability. So when you think about that, any of the project that is implementing in that particular area, that has to be bottom-up approach. All the group, marginalized group, youth, all the women should be incorporated in that types of plan. And most important, then we always mention the training, capacity building is really make a different value. You can give money, it would be just wiped down. But if you have very good training on several types of capacity building, for example, rainwater harvesting, homestead gardening, yielding of these cropping patterns, or some alternative income generation, that exactly many development organizations and NGOs are working here. So if you bring all together, and you mentioned that how the adaptation principles should be, if you think in that plate, and we believe that situation have the chance to more resilient.
Great. Hassan, thank you very much for those insights. And they basically reaffirm what we heard before: strengthening leadership, strengthening contribution, and building capacity. Thank you. So our last part of this session today is a Q&A with the audience. And we've seen so far only one question from the audience, as far as I can tell. And I'm asking panelists and attendees in particular, of course, to pose a question. And if you know who you want to ask, then put that into your question in the chat box, and we'll pose the question to whoever is being asked here. So my first question is, I don't know exactly who this comes from, unfortunately. I can't see that here. That's from Lisa Banda. Yes. How best can we market or communicate the need for adaptation, because it seems for countries are more focused on mitigation than adaptation? For instance, all 193 parties to the Paris Agreement issued at least a first NDC, while around 70 countries are now developing national adaptation plans. But adaptation or resilience is also mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So the question is, what can we do differently? Because adaptation for developing countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change is not an option, it's a must for survival now. So I'm going to open this question up to the panel, our speakers, Timo, Paul, and Marcus. Any of your insights to answer this question? Marcus, I think I see a thumbs up to that chat point. So maybe you want to add something? And if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Henry, I think Marcus has logged off or been thrown off, unfortunately. He's not online right now.
Oh, okay. That explains it.
That explains it, yes.
Timo, do you want to have a go at the question?
Yeah, actually, I was thanks. I was trying to read the question in parallel in the chat, but this question isn't in the chat. So
Oh,
if you could give me the essence of the question again, please.
so the question goes into the need to better communicate the need for adaptation. Because
Okay, now I can
countries seem
see it
to be,
in the chat.
yeah, so countries are more focusing on mitigation than adaptation. And what can be done differently? What's your thought?
Okay, so I think, I mean, for developing countries, adaptation is the key priority. That's what they always stress at the negotiations. So I think developing countries focus very much internationally on adaptation. On adaptation. So so that's in that regard, I think that's already the case. What we see, I mean, the National Adaptation Plan process is the key mechanism to coordinate or organize adaptation domestically. It is through the Paris Agreement mandatory. The Paris Agreement states shall as appropriate. And I think if you want to strengthen adaptation in developing countries, the NAP process is one of the key mechanisms to do so. Unfortunately, in some countries, like in Tanzania, where I was based, the plan and the process around the plan has evolved only very slowly, depending on available donor support. And when donor support ended, like the support I was involved in ended in 2019, and since then, the NAP process kind of didn't involve much. So I think there is still a lot more support that's needed, especially for LDCs, because it's not sufficient to just produce or develop a plan. What we saw in Tanzania is it's really important to mainstream adaptation in the different sectoral and line ministries. And that's one of the bottlenecks that I think many developing countries have, because the NAP ought not to be like a separate document on the side. We have to mainstream adaptation into all the sectoral planning and development planning. I think that's one of the key bottlenecks, and at the same time, one of the levers that could be used to strengthen adaptation in developing countries.
Great, thank you. We have a second question here from Kathy Vaughn. And the question is, what are key elements for an enabling environment for adaptation? How might the enabling environment in Bangladesh be improved? Now, throw this question to our three panelists, or whoever would like to pick it up from Bangladesh to answer. So what are key elements of an enabling environment for adaptation? And just
if I may.
Yes, please, Dilruba. Yes.
Yeah. No, I think enabling environment in Bangladesh, we already have an enabling environment. The government is very committed for adaptation actions. The government has recently finalized and approved a national adaptation plan. The government has only very, very recently, I think a couple of weeks back, approved the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. So the environment, the enabling environment is there. I don't know even if Kathy asked about enabling environment for women's leadership or women gender responsive climate action. If that is the case, then definitely the policies and plans have to be very specific about very gender focused. Specific action points for action plans for women focused action plans. Just for your information, Bangladesh government has recently revised It's in the process of approval, the Climate Change and Gender Action Plan. You and women who have supported the government to revise the document. I mean, these are the tools which give you these are the sort of the handles that help you to move forward with regards, gender responsive climate adaptation planning and adaptation actions. Yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know whether I have fully answered the question, but yeah, thank you.
Yes, yes, you certainly have, and added the gender component to it. So that's good. Thank you, Dilruba. John Geary has asked a question: what can be done to make climate change adaptation in coastal areas in Bangladesh give more importance to the impacts of ecosystem services for local people? And maybe Hassan, you might want to answer that question. I think that would be a good one for you.
Henry, would you please repeat this question, because I didn't find in my web chat here.
Yeah, no, the technology is tricky apparently, so I'll repeat the question.
Sure.
What can be done?
Hassan, it's in the Q&A part, if you can see that.
What can be done to make climate change adaptation in coastal areas in Bangladesh increase the importance to the impacts of ecosystem services for local people? So how can the assumption seems to be that climate change adaptation in coastal areas is not giving enough importance to ecosystem services.
Yes, you are quite right, definitely. Because if you think about the coastal area, you can see the western part of the coastal area is very close to the largest mangrove Sundarban. So it has its own ecosystem, number one. So the people who are living over there, that needs to be much more nature-based solutions. Or however, a vast people also depend on the Sundarban area. So there is some bit tricky trade-off there. How much you will go for the conservation, and how much you can provide for the livelihood of the people, because people live on this Sundarban over there. But definitely, if again, I will bring one of the point, the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous people, when people think about their livelihood, the 150 years ago, how the people live along with this Sundarban, that should be incorporated in such a way. On the other hand, the restoration of the Sundarban or restoration of the afforestation is going to be in practice as the saline water is coming inside the land. So people have the less water for their irrigation. So canal digging is a very important, because if you 30 years ago, 40 years ago, all the canals, they had a very good water sources. When you have a less water, so you can use that water for your irrigation. But this is a very adverse problem in the coastal belt, that they do not have enough good water for their irrigation because they have a saline water. But definitely digging this canal, this is one of the natural systems you can think about. However, for the drinking purpose, especially in the coastal belt, people mainly use the rainwater harvesting. And however, they take this water and they keep the also water in the pond, but that are not so much appropriate way. But irrigation perspective and agriculture perspective, there are several thinking, and people are working to bring much more nature-based solution and for restoration of the ecosystem.
Thank you, Hassan. Yes, if there is one question right now from the audience, we have time for one final question before we have to close. And I can see that Saqib and Salim Haq have raised their hands. I will give you the floor in a moment, Salim. So I'll pass on to Saqib first, and then I will close and pass it on to you to make some closing remarks, Salim, if you may.
Thank you, Henry. I had a question mainly to do with the adaptation financing presentations that we had, and predominantly to do with the fact that quite a lot of the adaptation projects seem to be small scale funding. As you mentioned, they're within the sort of 5 to 10 million range, which is the large majority of the funding projects. So what, in your experience or in the reports that you were gathering, could you do to sort of guide for having more programmatic and large-scale adaptation projects rather than just being piecemeal projects that they're doing, maybe programmatic funding or sort of institutional funding for local organizations that are likely to be able to carry on much longer than perhaps donor funding will last. And perhaps a related question on that is, even with the numbers that you're showing on the presentations, adaptation funding is still at a very small percentage compared to mitigation funding. And if you look at local adaptation funding, that's even less. It's possibly down to about single digits of the funding amounts that are coming through. So what would be some advice or tips that we would be doing in terms of designing these projects and programs, and how could we increase that scale?
Thanks, Saqib. Yes, Paul, are you there?
I am.
You're our finance guy.
Yes, I mean, strictly speaking, the first part of that question related to Timo's chapter. I don't know if you want to reply, but you can always perhaps respond afterwards. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the finance has been at a relatively small project scale. I think moving to programmatic scale involves getting different sources of financing. I think it also relates to the issue about moving from individual projects to integrating and mainstreaming adaptation into sort of more core mainstream development planning. So, I think that's partly the way that you move from smaller projects to actually the integration of large scale programs through sector development plans, through countries' medium-term expenditure frameworks, and through that sort of approach. In terms of the sort of overall size of things, I think it's important to highlight that yes, there is a lot more finance flowing to mitigation and adaptation, hugely. But part of the reason why that is because in the mitigation case, there is a lot more private sector finance flowing. And that's because of the nature of mitigation is easier to finance than for adaptation. So it's much easier to get a private investor to invest in a renewable farm, for example, because they get a high return. And one of the challenges that we face is trying to generate enough incentives for the private sector to invest in adaptation. So, I think partly that is, there's partly a use of trying to use the available finance that we have from the public sector and try and encourage that. I think, using it to exploit and more innovative approaches, that's certainly something we can do. But I think, this is always going to be a challenge for us. It's always going to be slightly more difficult to raise and to generate lots of adaptation finance flows for adaptation than mitigation. And in some ways, I suppose as the problem gets bigger, that will flip and people will realize the value of investing in adaptation. But still at the moment, it seems we're not there yet. So I hope that sort of answered the question. Hopefully things will start to improve, and there definitely have been improvements. But yeah, you're right, we still have a long way to go. Over.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And unfortunately, I can't pass the word back to Timo here to add on it because we're running out of time. And I'd like to give Salim the opportunity to say a few last words before we close this session. So Salim, as the host, essentially the host of this Gobeshona conference, and ICAD being one of the most important voices in the adaptation and development space, the floor is yours. Salim, please.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry. I just wanted to take the floor to thank you, Timo, Paul, and Marcus for taking the time to make the presentation, and my Bangladeshi colleagues for being panelists. I thought this was a very, very rich discussion. And I'd like to end by offering you, Henry, as you plan the next adaptation gap report, whether or not there might be a possibility of doing, if not a full chapter, maybe a box on the experience of Bangladesh, because I can assure you, all the lessons that you gave us, we have known for some time, and we are working on them for some time. Not least the mainstreaming of climate change adaptation into national planning. The current budget of Bangladesh has 8% of the budget allocated to tackling climate change across more than 20 ministries. That's about $2 billion of our own money in our own budget. No other country is anywhere near doing that. So, think about that. Might be worth thinking about for the next report. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. And I'm pretty sure that we have space for a box on an experience I mean, Bangladesh has been showing some really good results in some areas of adaptation, no doubt. So I think that's something that we can arrange. Yes. Looking forward to your contribution to this year's report. And unfortunately, we have to end now. Our time's up. And I guess the key messages that I've been hearing from the speakers, of course, I know the results of the report, but also the panelists whose contribution I would really was really important, I think, to show what effective adaptation looks like in reality. And the message was quite clear. Bring local leaders, youth, women, and other members of local communities into the planning, the implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation process. Provide them with the capacity and the financial needs necessary, provide the enabling environment, and then adaptation outcomes will be better, at least better, if not very good. And with that, I would like to thank you all and wish you a good evening, good afternoon, or good day, wherever you may be. Thank you.
Sorry, before we leave, can we have a group picture?
Thank you all very much.
Oh, so we're asked to all turn on our, is that a turn on our videos?
Cameras on, please. Yes.
Everybody turn on their cameras so that we get a shot from everybody.
Let us know when you're done.
Yes, I think we're done.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
All the
sir.
best.
Good day from Dhaka.